And a little bit of background. We started as good societies do with an honourable intention of running a sort of traditional conference that the society has run every year since 19 whatever it was, very, very long time. James very kindly put an agenda together, and everybody sort of gave a rather insipid and didn't really leap on the bus with what was proposed. But we needed to do something, and with time running out and umpteen distractions, and the fact that actually we've done a dozen events this year anyway of various sorts, and joined in with other people's conferences and run successful sessions there, we thought actually, you know, we ought to have more of a conversation than a set piece presentation of people's ideas. And in order to get that conversation going, presidential privileges, I suppose, arbitrarily picked on two people. One is James, because James started the argument in the first place, so it seemed reasonable to let him continue. And Vanilla, because I wanted to go somewhere completely different where we'd never been before, which was into the space of cybernetics and art. The question of the relevance of cybernetics comes up because as you might have seen in my blog fairly recently, people keep saying to me, what is it? And I've gone to great lengths to explain to various people in various different languages what I think it means. And then the what's it for and what use is it tend to come up as fairly important questions. So I thought it was worth our while as a learned society, and now one dedicated to the art of education, as of half an hour ago, to actually start to explore that and say, what is this stuff? What does it mean in a modern world, and what can we do with it? So that's enough from me at this point. The game is Vanilla is going to lead us off with a discussion from her perspective. We may want to ask questions for clarification, Vanilla, after that. And then we will hear from James on his perspective. I have no idea what James is going to say, so that's sort of quite exciting. And we'll then have discussions of various sorts around the table to reflect on those two things. And depending on how the afternoon progresses, we may break out into breakout rooms and have smaller discussions, or we may keep it all in the plenary. But really...
Sorry, did you mean to call me?
What?
Sorry?
Ah, sorry. Yeah, no, it comes through to me. It's forwarded because he...
Red quadrant, you probably need to put yourself on mute, or we'll have to do it for you. Because I think your
Caitlin, you can put everybody on mute as the host and unmute whoever's speaking.
Thanks, Miguel. So without any further ado, I think I'm going to come straight to you, Vanilla, if everybody understands what's going on. We'll start with that. So if you, Caitlin, you're the host, if you can mute everybody except Vanilla, but allow me to share my screen, which I know.
Have you had the vote already, John?
We have had the votes already. That was done in the SGM between 1 and 1:30.
Thanks.
I'm going to unmute myself to just answer your question, Alan. Yeah, the meeting was at 1 o'clock. We have voted to change the modest change to the rules so that we are described in HMRC terms as a charity, so that if we ever stop trading, our money has to go to a charity, which is fine. And we've endorsed the appointment of Caitlin as the secretary. And then there was some exciting AOB around the use of PayPal and that sort of stuff, but that needn't detain us at this point. Okay, so thank you for that. So we'll try again. So shut me up, please, Caitlin. Give Vanilla the microphone, and Vanilla, you'll have to just tell me when you'd like me to move the slides on, which I'm just about to share now. And if I can work out how to do this, that's the one I want. Can everybody see that?
Yeah.
Yep. Okay. Can you hear me? Nope.
Yeah.
Oh, good. Well, first of all, I'd like to say thank you to John Beckford for inviting me. This is very humbling to to be talking to the Cybernetics Society today. I'd like to thank Angus as well, Angus Jenkinson, who first suggested this last year. He sent me some notes to consider that are, alas, far more erudite than anything I plan to present to you. My difficulty is that I'm not a cybernetician, and I'm only here because Stafford Beer is my father. Having been brought up by Stafford, I can walk the walk and talk the talk, but I have absolutely no practical experience. On the plus side, I have a lifetime of practical artistic endeavour to bring to the debate, and the relevance of cybernetics to art. This is not the place, nor is there the time to reflect on the nature of art or cybernetics. So all that follows is in very general terms and will certainly have vast gaps, but let it be a start. Reflecting with a friend on art and cybernetics, I was forced to confess that I knew nothing of the interaction, but then neither did anyone else. So as I say, let it be a start. And let's start with some art. So here we have a picture by Rembrandt. You're probably all familiar with it. This is 1632, called The Anatomy Lesson of Dr. Nicholas Tulp. Science and communication. Here are both science in operation, communication in all its covert and sensational forms. We are introduced to a post-enlightenment image of death with another kind of priest making the blessing. This from a time when people carried a severed limb or lost body part with themselves to ensure that it was buried with them and could thus be reassembled with the owner on the day of resurrection. Mutilating corpses was not only disastrous in this life, evidently, but went on through eternity. Each of these faces would have meant something to the audience. Painting an anatomy lesson was an annual event. The artist selected with care, and the corpse always a hanged criminal. This one was called Adrian Zoon, an armed robber, hanged on the 31st of January in 1632. You can look up the other models if it's of interest. And naturally, you paid the artist if you wanted to be included as a spectator in this event. Moving slightly later, between 1795 and 1805, we find William Blake. Can we move on one, John? Here we go. Here's William Blake commenting on Newton. Newton posing as God. He was anathema to Blake, who said, "Art is the tree of life. Science is the tree of death." How good a communicator was Blake? It's hard to read from this picture how much he disapproved of Newton or his work. Does this make it a failure as a work of art? Moving on, thank you, to 1768 and Joseph Wright of Derby. This is his record of the creation of a vacuum. In those days, artists and scientists mixed freely. Home demonstrations of experiments were not unusual. The demonstrator here, geezer in the middle, is probably James Ferguson, Fellow of the Royal Society, and the man at the bottom is probably Erasmus Darwin. There's lots of scholarship around this picture, all lookable, uppable. Anyway, both Ferguson and Darwin were friends of the artist. You can see by the full moon in the window that this was probably one of the lunar clubs that met in one place or another, because you could see your way home at night. You can also see here that girls are rubbish at science and boys are interested in seeing things die. You see the young man on the, I don't know which side of the screen it'll be for you, and under the man with the stripy shirt, who's in love with the young girl, and so life goes on regardless of all these advances, whatever they mean. It's a fabulous picture, actually, really bears investigation, but that's not necessarily what we're about today. Here's another from Joseph Wright, if you wouldn't mind moving on, John, featuring actually some of the same models, and we have a philosopher lecturing on the orrery. And again, another very decent piece of work. And the next, which shows us an alchemist, also Joseph Wright of Derby. And again, under the full moon. Here we see the discovery of phosphorus. This is made by fermenting urine and described in a chemistry book by Jean-Pierre Marquer and shown to Wright by the Liverpool chemist Matthew Turner. So poor old Joseph Wright had trouble selling these pictures. They didn't appeal to collectors, though the public apparently loved them. So what were they for? And not so much art, I venture, as illustrations, events that Joseph Wright saw as noteworthy in his epoch. A passionate documentation of world-changing experiments. He was interested. He spoke with scientists and the thinkers of his day. Though I must say that the term science, according to Angus, wasn't coined until much later by William Whale. These images communicate on a vast scale. They have the picture of the event followed by all the little details that are indeed worth 1,000 words. So I can't actually resist throwing in some portraits of scientists. Here we have next Dr. Pierre Boucaud. He's painted by Tamara de Lampica, sorry, I can never pronounce her. Boucaud had isolated the Lactobacillus acidophilus, which I also can't pronounce, and created a drug called lacetol, an anti-diarrheal medicine. Anti-diarrheal, yeah, didn't give you diarrhea, that caused him to get rich enough to commission this work of art. A scientist as glamorous knight in money and success and armor. Next, please. This is a metal plaque coming up, which I found in my local museum, dating from 1851 and 1901, showing our hero with a Bunsen burner. You can see him there, looking very thoughtful and being attended by bare-breasted beauties. Pour la patrie et la vérité, for France and for truth, reads the inscription. There's truth holding the light up high, and France bestowing the laurels. It was engraved by Jules Chaplin, who designed some of the French gold franc coins of the day. And I think the scientist is Marcelin Berthelot, but probably you guys know better. Anyway, it's in the Musée Marie Petiet in Limoux, near to me. And this is a museum dedicated entirely to the work of one woman. So I've really no idea what it was doing there. And it's been closed ever since I first saw it. So I may not find out for some time. Grâce à COVID. Next, please, we have a contemporary picture of Alan Turin, which I particularly like. It's affectionate and dispassionate, which is, of course, a very tricky balance. I hope you all like this. This is by Marlene Dumas, who's a remarkably fine painter, in my opinion. And next, please, we have another contemporary work. This is by Ai Weiwei, and a contemporary response to science, a fine illustration of cybernetics. The Watcher watched, the Watcher incorporated, not yet, just invoked. Who is looking at who? Are we only being reminded that we are watched? Which doesn't lose the watchedness of what is actually a traditionally carved lump of marble. It's called the surveillance camera, and he did it in 1910. And when I first saw it, it was in a prison in Avignon, which is remarkable. Anyway, this takes us back to cybernetics and art, and to the defining exhibition, Cybernetics and Serendipity, which in 1968 was held in the ICA in London. I have a copy of the catalogue, which is full of little delights, but in general, and with notable exceptions, the art proposals simply offer to replace human generators with robot or computer activity. The notable exceptions are, of course, Gordon Pask and Stafford Beer, and you may spot the bias. They made cybernetic machines rather than devices for imitating humans. The exhibition was a wonder that introduced another dimension of cybernetics to a larger public, but as far as I can tell, has had little long-term effect on the arts. You might like to discuss that. So cybernetics looks at systems and ameliorates them to be better at what they do. Stafford was fond of saying that in the light of automation, the only human prerogative would be to err. Error, I suggest, is the basis of most contemporary art. The dread of self-pastiche is central to contemporary artists. So how do you move into uncharted territory? By cultivating mistakes. The traditional contemporary routes are like tarot or dreams or the many games that the surrealists invented. This is all quite self-limiting, and maybe cybernetics can help. After all, both cybernetics and art are fundamentally about making decisions and entering uncharted territory. Another Stafford saying, always make machines even if you don't know what they are for. Here are some crossover maxims. The making of a distinction is the beginning of order. Uncertainty is a condition which is met whenever we leave the confines of a closed or deterministic system. And my final question to you, and I need a slide for this, John, please. Is it art? How do we know what is art? How do we recognize it? Is it a work of art? I have a story about this, which I'd like to tell you before I hand you back to debate. I was trying to work out how to round up these pictures with the idea of evaluating a work of art. And I thought, I'll knock up something. I'll go and find a test tube and bung a flower in it. So I couldn't find the test tubes, but I found these flasks in the bathroom. And as I took them over to my studio, I picked up some ivy and bunged them in, put them on the table. And as soon as I took the photo, I was thrilled. And I knew I had made a piece of art. That's how you know. The whole viscera responds. And in fact, I think this is probably going to be my Christmas card if I get any Christmas cards together this year. So then I thought, I may be clocking this as a work of art. I don't know that anybody else will be. So over to the debate. It's all yours, John.
I was gripped. Am I on? Yes, I am on. I was gripped, Vanilla. So everybody, I've had the privilege of being able to look at these pictures for 2 or 3 weeks, in fact, in advance of you all seeing them. And I was fascinated by that end one and trying to work out how many different things it was trying to say to me. I'm probably not noted for my art appreciation. So my wife and children would undoubtedly say. I took several things out of that. That's really, really, really lovely. And so my big things are, what's a cybernetician? And because that's baffled me for the last 30 years. The art and visualization, I think, is really interesting. A big theme of, as it happens, my week this week has been about how we represent some of these ideas into organizations, and we do it pictorially because the pictures tell us far more than the words ever will. I like the, I wander around the prison and the prisoner all the time, and the nature of that relationship. Cybernetics as alchemy, I absolutely loved. That sort of notion that what we're doing is in some way perceived, at least, as somewhat magical by the people that are the work benefiting from it. So those were sort of my instant reactions to that. Does anybody, before, because the plan is to hear Vanilla, to hear James, and then sort of wander off into proper discussion. But if anybody's got any sort of quick comments or suggestions, questions for Vanilla, that would be a good moment to ask them. David.
thank you very much, echoing John, but additionally, I want to say how much I loved the final display of the ivy between two flasks, which very much reminds me of my battle against brambles for the last several decades. And many of you will be aware that what they do is shoot massively up and then descend into the ground again and form roots at the other end, which is why I get irritated when people talk about the root causes of things, when leaves and roots are just the forefront of an expanding organization, and in terms of things going in all directions at once and somewhat circular. I think it's as cybernetic as, you know, the mind can hold at this time of year, etc., etc. So thank you very much.
Malcolm.
Yeah, it's more an observation that might frame the discussion rather than a question. But Vanilla there mentioned 1968 and like the cybernetic art, and did mention the fact that it didn't seem to have much impact. And I think this is a fairly subtle idea to perhaps consider. Are we limiting it to cybernetic art, as in Gordon Pask's stuff in the 60s? Or should we be looking at the cybernetics of the art process, which involves both the producer and the receiver? So in other words, as you interact with art, whether that's a picture or a piece of drama or a piece of literature, what is the whole cognitive process that's going on? And can that be considered in cybernetic terms? So the system involves a human and something else interaction. I see Paul Pangaro's here, and of course, the metaphor here, or the analogy here, is human-computer interaction.
Thanks, Malcolm. Michael, you've got your hand up. You're on mute, old chap.
As someone who's a practicing artist with a background using technology, I find this really intriguing, really kind of interesting. And during my practice-led PhD, I read Andrew Pickering's book. He's here. Also, people like Nicholas Luhmann, who talks about art as a social system. And in there, the kind of connections are really quite wonderfully mapped out historically. And I think it's a really interesting point about where this has all gone, because there's too much, I think, of a crude association between the idea of cybernetics and computing, let's say, and digital technologies. And in a way, the art crowd has sort of undermined the real broader philosophical meanings of cybernetics. And I think there's so many overlapping areas of you know, in a way, Pickering's book discusses science as a kind of an art, you know, the notion of a dance of agency. And there are old artistic principles which originated from the arts and crafts movement and from architecture, actually. For example, the idea of truth to materials, which means that you kind of push and pull, but you try not to, you cannot force the materials to do things that they're not meant to do. So there's a giving into, a submission to the systems, technologies, or actual physical materials that you're working with. And I think it's an extremely cybernetic idea that's very relevant to this discussion. So thank you for that.
Thanks, Michael. So what I'm going to do is, Fabian, you've got your hand up. I'll take a comment from you. Then I'm going to go to James. And James, you can make your comment as the segue to the introduction to your session, if that's okay. So Fabian first, and then we'll go to James. Thank you.
Okay, just a brief point. In terms of your presentation, very much in terms of visual arts. I was also thinking of the arts in a broader sense, and in particular with I.A. Richards, who's involved in literary criticism, who was significant in the Métis conferences as well. So I don't necessarily want to open the field too much, but it seems to me that there's quite a lot going on there. And maybe if we limit ourselves to the visual arts, that's fine. But I think we need to be aware that there's a bigger field out there that we can perhaps follow up later on.
Brilliant, thanks, Fabian. I think the point this afternoon for me is to kind of see where this takes us. So no directions are closed off at this stage of proceedings by any stretch of the imagination. So James, we'll hold James Bryant responsible partly for us being here this afternoon. I have no idea what you're going to say, James. So I'm really looking forward to hearing this. So if you can give James the magic wand, Caitlin, and then we'll crack on.
I've already made him co-host.
So you should be able to see my slideshow. Confirmation, please. Yeah, fantastic. Yep. So yeah, I sort of feel like it's one of those things where you were saying about Caitlin not stepping back fast enough. I'm in that sort of position. I was trying to work out whether Pope's "Fools Rush In Where Angels Fear to Tread" was most appropriate, or Daniel in the Lion's Den. It's very sort of down as a provocation. I know there's very easy ways to start sort of fights in a bar, and you know, I could mention the word Brexit, and I'm sure it would be quite provocative. But what I'm going to go through now, I'm not sure how provocative it will be, but I hope it is provocative. Please remember that if you do find it highly provocative, that I will quote at you Shakespeare, Henry IV, Part 1 of "I so offend to make offence a skill." I've retitled, and thank you very much. We really haven't collaborated on this, Vanilla and myself, but I've retitled this "What's the Purpose of Cybernetics?" and I'm actually amazed, I suppose, that we may find it difficult to understand art as a cybernetic process, because when we start to look at the definition of where it came from, which is what I'm about to do, and I apologize, obviously most of you, or not all of you, have read the stuff I'm about to go through. The artist, as I understand it, arranges, especially going back into the past, the photograph or the picture or the installation or the piece of sculpture in such a manner as to provoke a response from the audience. So you have the artist working with the medium to create a communication, and that communication then derives a response from the audience. And you know, in wondering about the relevance of cybernetics, I've gone back to our friend Werner, but I'm going to make a provocation here to begin with, and that is that, having looked at and read an awful lot on cybernetics over the last couple of years, it seems to me that there was this highly, and to others obviously because I've drawn on what I've read, but there was this highly productive period between the 1940s and the 1960s, some talk about into the 70s and 80s, where the field was highly productive. You've got the Macy groups being started post Weiner's book, and coining the term cybernetics, and then you've got the Ratio Club in the UK, and it's massively productive. There are some huge names that were involved in the very beginning of cybernetics that went on to, well, they weren't huge names, but they became huge names, in part or in large part for some of them by utilizing the thought process of cybernetics. But it seems that cybernetics has kind of dissolved somewhere in the late 60s, 70s, with the coming of second order cybernetics. And you end up with this sort of circularity and this introspection of cybernetics, and a more theoretical cybernetics rather than a pragmatically applied cybernetics. You look on the American Society's website, and there are 48 definitions of cybernetics, and there's a very famous joke, as I'm sure you all know, by Stafford, about people being executed, and the guy deciding that he'll be executed after the person has come up with the absolute definition of cybernetics. So this is not a new concept. It's also cybernetics, it seems to have developed this wall of terminology, and rather than being a sort of all-encompassing tool, if you like, to bring in scientists from across disciplines, it seems to have evolved this sort of set of terminology that at first you need to come to terms with before you can then begin to assess what cybernetics is about. And there's plenty in the literature to say that cybernetics isn't really delivering. And my proposition here is that it is because it's lost the purpose for which it was intended by the person that coined the term. So if we delve in and ask Mr. Weiner or Dr. Weiner what he thinks, the summary, and I've got slides behind this that I've taken out of his book and gone through and highlighted the text, if we want to get into kind of detail. But his purpose for cybernetics was it was a name for a field of communication and control. What we find is, picking up on what Vanessa was saying, is that there was a quote in there that says, making of distinctions is the beginning of order. It also seems the beginning of conflict. So when you go down and chunk down and start defining, you end up with people taking obviously different points of view. And Weiner was trying to give this all-encompassing concept. He wanted to provide unity and some common terminology, because he found that there wasn't a common terminology and all the other sciences had their own specific approaches, and to adopt one of those would actually be to, if you like, side on the side of one particular discipline or another. And what he really wanted to do was to enable, and he specifically says scientists, but of course artists and anyone else, from different disciplines to be able to share an understanding and work together, because he identified that there was a massive amount of duplication going on within different disciplines, that within biology and within physics and within engineering, people were looking at the same kind of problems and independently generating their own solutions, which ended up being very, very similar. And he was thinking that actually, if somebody in biology knew what somebody in engineering was doing, that they could accelerate what they were doing by dragging the information and the knowledge across. And he identified that there were these boundary areas between the disciplines where there was nothing occupying that space that was helpful. And then he talks about cybernetic problems, and he said, well, the thing is to solve cybernetic problems, and defines cybernetics as control and communication. Now, we've already sort of touched on art. Art is, I would posit, about controlling of the image and the representation that the artist produces, that then communicates something to the audience. So art, and I would suggest that pretty much everything that we do can be considered as a cybernetic problem and a cybernetic issue. So just to prove it, these are bits of text. As I said, that if we want to go through, and you'll notice it is a word I'd never seen before, quadruplicated. So there was obviously a lot of duplication, or double duplication, there we go, going on. He did a lot of pre-work with people finding that this proposition actually worked, where he ended up with engineers using terms from physiology. There was no, as I say, no common name, and hence cybernetics. So what's the evidence of cybernetic problems out there in the real world? So to pick up on what's the relevance to contemporary society, I think all real world problems can be considered to be cybernetic. There are what are termed wicked problems, which are probably most in need of cybernetic approach. I think the coronavirus and our response to it can be considered to be a cybernetic problem. But where are the voices calling for all the cyberneticians to step forward and solve our problems. We are, I think, a bunch of people with a huge amount of knowledge and capability, but no one's calling for us. Now, the interesting thing to me as well is I'm in a whole bunch of different groups, which I consider all of them to be aspects of cybernetics. And all of those are looking at the same problems. The systems scientists, I'm a member of the IIIS, IIIS. And they've got the same kind of issues. They're looking at the same issues, going, why aren't we being sort of called upon? Why don't people understand about system science? And actually, I was in a meeting that was a bit provocative the other day, so much so that the person hosting it pulled the plug on the Zoom meeting because it got quite provocative, obviously too provocative. So John, please don't pull the plug today, however hot it gets. So I think that there are cybernetic problems everywhere, especially if you consider human behavior, how we behave towards the planet and each other to be a cybernetic problem. And actually it's there waiting for us to address in all its diversity. And just to finish on something I picked up the other day when I was doing some research is this comment, which is actually referred to in Weiner's book. And this is actually by Samuel Butler in a thing I'd never even heard of called Erewhon, his utopian novel from I think it's 1882. And you can quite happily transpose this into current conversations about AI. So persistent problems, wicked problems, nothing new perhaps, but calling for cyberneticians. So I don't know if I'm going to start a fight in an empty room, but that's my provocation. I think everything's a cybernetic problem, and it's time that we step forward and solve some of them. The question is obviously, where's it gone? There we go. Will we?
You got the final slide in, James. So I'm going to quadruplify your provocation, I think. Well, so Bruce has just put an interesting one: is everything a cybernetic problem or a systemic problem? And what wandering through my head was, is the problem cybernetic, or does it lend itself to cybernetic description and whatever the word is, amelioration, let's call it? So can we address a problem using, so is the cybernetics in the problem or in the approach to solving the problem, or quite possibly both? And I'm looking at Professor Pickering when I'm saying that. I'm thinking, because I could see something was going on there. So you're saying, James, yes, it's all relevant, but we're not using it.
Yes.
Is that a very, very short summary of what you've just said to us? It's all out there, but we haven't got a single coherent approach to it. We're not being demanded. Robin, you've got your hand up wherever you are. I can't see you on my screen at the moment. I see yours as well, Malcolm.
Yeah, 2 points. First one, clearly on your LinkedIn call for the date on that penultimate slide on the quote. So I overestimated a little bit. I was thinking Roman or perhaps Greek, but I think it still could be taken as, you know, they had those same issues back in those times, and the world, as long as we have intelligence, has been faced with cybernetic problems.
Yeah, people have been breaking machines up for various reasons, especially in this country, for quite some period of time, when they threatened their jobs, threatened to displace them in Ashbean terms from their ability to earn. So yeah, it could way back.
The second point is, I suppose, the reason we're not called upon is because most of the people who have the power do not have the cybernetic lens to look through, and are most of the time looking the other way. So the just concept, the idea, the ignorance from their part of the whole subject matter is just clearly very visible.
Which is brilliant, given the definition we've just put on the society, John. for the purposes of HMRC. So
what we say and what we do are not necessarily the same thing. Paul Pangaro, you put a really interesting comment there into the chat. Would you like to share with everybody, please?
Most recent comment? I've been putting various comments in and various offers to users.
The cybernetic lens question.
Yeah. Cybernetics is about how we look, right? That's the second order view. I don't agree that everything is a cybernetic problem. I would rather say I can look at a stone as not being a cybernetic problem. Or I can look at it in the context of its environment and then imagine, conjure, conceive how it relates to its surroundings. And that's the cybernetic viewpoint. So I have too many comments in general to make. Certainly wicked problems need cybernetics. I would go there. And I offer a link to some work I'm doing modestly on this side of the Atlantic and maybe crossing over at some point. But I prefer to defer to Professor Pinkerton before I say anything further. Andy, what would you add?
Andrew, please.
You're deferring to me. You could say that the world is full of problems, wicked problems. Cybernetics should be able to provide a solution. I'd be very interested to hear somebody come up with some examples of what a distinctive cybernetic approach to any of the world's problems would be. You know, I mean, the discussions in the old Macy conferences were very concrete and down to earth about, you know, specific phenomena, how to act. The cyberneticians themselves had, you know, all these concrete projects in the world, including artworks, one could say. I think Stafford Beer's last public talk was about the start of the war on terror. You know, he wanted to talk about how to engage with that. You know, maybe in venues like this, we ought to try and think of some concrete solutions along cybernetic lines. What would we do instead of, you know, sitting around saying, well, it would be nice to do something. That's my immediate thought.
I think what would we do is I'm writing notes as we go. What would we do, I think, is a really interesting question. So Gerard, do you want to come in as well there, and then Malcolm afterwards? You're on mute, Gerard. You're still on mute. You might be on silent as well as on mute, Gerard.
You missed something.
That's better. We missed all of that, Gerard. Would you like to start again?
Yes, I will. Well, the main point is that I disagree with the notion that every problem is a cybernetic problem. And to argue that, I would like to go back to the time that cybernetics was developed as a discipline, which was pre-Second World War and Second World War. And in Weiner's book, it is mentioned that there was a specific problem that actually led to the development of what he considered cybernetics, which was the problem of escaping being shot down. So he explicitly indicates that it is not going somewhere, but escaping from somewhere, given your own objective. So I think that any problem where there is an objective and where there is a difficulty of escaping such that you can actually solve the problem might be considered one of the original problems for cybernetics. And it's in the way that I formulate it, it's very different from the usual definition where we say well, we would like to identify and support what it is that we can do when we have, for example, a threat like COVID. The main point that I think Weiner would make is that the problem is how to escape, given the fact that we have limited resources. So just a contribution in terms of what a cybernetic problem might be.
Thank you. Malcolm.
Yeah, sort of directly addressing James's presentation, I think I read an article somewhere recently that said cybernetics is now nowhere and everywhere. And in some ways, it may well have actually fulfilled its function. I mean, let me just give you some reflections on me since I've started reading it. Go back 35 years and I came across someone called Christopher Caldwell, who was a Marxist literary critic, very much influenced by I.A. Richards, who has just been mentioned previously. Now, for him, the function of literature was to basically adapt to a human environment. This book, Science of Storytelling, which I used in my presentation 3 months ago, this is all about neuroscience, but it says, and I quote, "We're a hypersocial species with domesticated brains that have been engineered specifically to control an environment of humans." So we've got an idea here of control. Then we've got this idea again of maybe anthropology. When I did anthropology 35 years ago, what is the function of literature? Social cohesion, control, feedback. Maybe against that, you've got the Frankfurt School, back to literary critics in the 1930s, which is about critique. And then I've heard about systems thinking, very much with its iceberg model being about critique. Is cybernetics about critique? This idea about adapting to and constructing your environment, well, actually, that also reminds me of biology and niche construction. So in that last 2 minutes, I've mentioned Marxist literary criticism, the Frankfurt School, neuroscience, anthropology, and biology. Or am I just reading too much into it? So that it actually doesn't it ceases to have any meaning whatsoever.
Yeah, if I can kick back in, I mean, Paul, I'd love to debate with you the cybernetics or otherwise of a rock. I've been having exactly that conversation with John. So you know, maybe here isn't the place, but I'd love to have that conversation. As a sort of relatively newcomer to cybernetics, there seems to be a lack of what I would call pragmatic application. There's a lot of application to theorizing and what I would call soft things, but there doesn't seem to be a lot of visible application to hard stuff. You know, the dealing with things like the pandemic, yeah, things like issues on social media and those kind of problems. So the economy, I mean, all sorts of real world problems are, I believe, cybernetic, if you consider that it's about communication and control. And if you go as far as Ashby and look at cybernetics as being displacement and the control of displacement. If you go further, then you can begin to go away from it into different areas, and they've all got obviously a huge validity in what they're looking at. But the original bits that we started with, the bits that drove people to come up with pragmatic outcomes, seems to be the bit that I'm not seeing. They might be out there, but I'm not coming across them.
I think there's something really interesting about the notion of pragmatism in that, James, and what do you think you mean by pragmatism, and how might other people interpret that? I think is a space. And just for the avoidance of doubt, James and I were debating the nature of rock earlier and whether it should be igneous or Blackpool. So just to put it into context, Ben, you've had your hand up for a while.
Yeah, I guess I want to pivot this back to Vanilla's presentation a bit. And I think implied in James's sort of entry into the question is a kind of stance towards the world of problem solving. I hope that's sort of fair, James. You can maybe correct me when you come back in, but there's a sort of, here's some problems, let's go and address them. You know, this is one stance you can have on the world. And in a way, I think, especially as you move it back to the 50s and 60s, the kind of potential, you can see the sort of potential of that kind of mindset that kind of happened, right? That those sort of ideas did things, as you're saying. And one of those, I guess, was transdisciplinarity, particular kinds of science, and that kind of happened, and that's, enters the world. And these things then don't need, cybernetics is, in those senses, is a bit like, Randolph used to call them a ladder idea, which I think he got from Baselsfeld, maybe. He used to say to me in one of my projects, he'd say, well, this is a ladder idea. It's really helpful for getting where you want to go, but if you carry it around strapped to your back, it's probably going to get in the way later. So I think it's just one of those things. It sort of drops away. You don't need to keep explaining where things have come from all the time. And I'm interested in maybe what cybernetics can do now. Like, I think it has different sorts of opportunities. I am not so positive about, I'm also in these, different forums where people sit around thinking, why aren't people asking us to solve their problems? And I often just think that it's a strange room that is in, because I'm in lots of other conversations with people doing practical work with similar, where those ideas are applied and so on. And I think it's slightly, the groups and the situations you create, and so possibly it's about finding a different community. But also, I think part of maybe the potential of cybernetics in a concrete way maybe goes, I see more from Vanilla's point of view, more from the connection to art, and not necessarily art in the gallery art kind of way, but how the kinds of stance to the world of art, of critique or surprise or reframing or new possibility might become present in some of the other places cybernetics touches. So, how a internet platform might be like a Rembrandt painting or something like that. So how the world could be much more provocative which is sort of opening up new things rather than solving the problems we've got. And that's one place I see a connection that's a possible thing now. Thanks.
So I think I'd like to build on that, Ben, because the work I've been doing this year has been really interesting. I am doing practical cybernetics for a rather well-known national railway organisation in the UK, trying to solve challenges, and their informational challenges, about the interaction between weather and assets and performance of railways, which are, it's a massively complex problem. It's enormous fun to play with. But the client, the individual at the client end, happens to have a PhD in fine art. And his fine art was the application. He was drawing and painting from physics and meteorology, and so his whole sort of PhD is built around basically pictures of weather, for want of a better way of describing it, and sort of deeply into the physics and quantum theory and all sorts of other stuff. And in the conversations that we have, I tend to draw pictures. I'm picking up here now from Andrew's comment, I think. I tend to draw pictures, representations of the problem that I'm observing in their organization, in the interactions between the elements of the things that they're drawing out. And because Brian is coming at it with an artistic mindset, he's also seeing pictures. And what it enables us to do is to pick up or create, if you like, a shared space which is both visual and oral, as of describing and seeing the problem in similar ways, which also allows us to overlay that with, if you like, the cybernetic language, the interpretation of the picture. And his ultimate compliment to me was, well, I think we ought to put some of your diagrams in an art gallery, John, because they're so sort of expressive of what's going on. And interestingly, he's now started drawing diagrams of his own problems. But the picture creates a shared space that we are both observing, which displaces the problem from being his or mine to become ours, and allows us to jointly interpret that world, which lets us then start to think about what amelioration or improvement or dissolution of problems might begin to look like. So I'm getting my appreciation of art back, Vanilla, because I'm suddenly starting to see how to represent my world in pictures that are meaningful. Andrew, you had your hand back up. And you're on silent.
Yeah. I mean, just picking up on these remarks about, pragmatism and making things concrete, maybe we should think a bit more about art. So, Gordon Pask had this kind of all-purpose idea that art is a conversation, kind of second-order cybernetics thing. The artist with the material, the viewer with the artwork, kind of back and forth. But of course, Pask also produced artworks, which I think of as being kind of iconic of cybernetics. They stand for what cybernetics was and is. So I'm thinking about his famous music color machine, the colloquy of mobiles as recreated by Paul Pangaro, who might say something about it, interactive theatre, interactive architecture. There's this very distinctive tradition of cybernetic art, which I had thought maybe Vanilla was going to talk about in the first instance. I find it very interesting to think about these kind of concrete cybernetic ways of going on in the arts. Of course, Stafford Beer was also a bit of an artist. We could think about the kinds of artworks that he made. But that seems like a kind of profitable direction for a conversation about what cybernetics can do in the world, as exemplified, in this case, in art. Very different art form from, the paintings and the sculptures that you find hanging around in art museums, for example. Is anybody interested in that kind of thing? Possibly Vanilla?
Can I join in?
Yes, by all means.
Oh, I didn't realize I wasn't muted. Yes, the business of making art is artist specific. I'm very familiar with Pask's work, and I don't know if you're familiar with Joseph Beuys's work, the anthropothological. The artist is everybody. Everybody who lives and breathes is an artist, and anything they make comes into the category of art. And Gordon, as you've pointed out, was very keen on engaging the world in art practices. Practices is the wrong word, and I'm floundering here because I haven't thought this through. But the whole process of art seems to me to be more about experiment than outcome. It's process driven rather than let's make a thing driven. Certainly in fine art, in damn fine art, that is the case. I mean, I recently had a commission which was so open-ended, it was almost paralyzing, which was marvelous, where I was told basically to do what I like as long as it wasn't a painting. Hola. But that's by the by. I'm just trying to think now about what you've said. I don't know, of course, all the processes that artists use, I see as cybernetic. That you're all the time engaged in checks and balances, in recursivity, in, I forget all the terms, we know them all. And all of these terms apply to a creative process all the time. Otherwise, you're unbalanced. It doesn't work. In the same way that if you were trying to solve the problems of a company, you know when it's skewed because it doesn't work. There again, you have to work out what the purpose of the company is, the posywid, and you also have to work out why you think a piece of art works. These are huge and endlessly entertaining questions that we can discuss for the next 4 years and get no direction. Sorry, I'm rambling.
Yeah, I mean, I wasn't talking about the process. Maybe the process is the same for all artists. What I was trying to say is that there's this tradition of a certain kind of artwork that has emerged in the history of cybernetics, you know, typified by interacting robots. Interactive architecture is an incredibly important kind of architecture in the world today. It's very different from, you know, fine art. The cyberneticians produce different kinds of objects.
Yes.
Which I would say conjure up a different kind of world, not a fixed world, but a dynamic, performative, active world, which I take to kind of dramatize what cybernetics has been about in a rather specific way. And if we wanted to address wicked problems, then what's the equivalent of doing that kind of work in a different field?
I wonder if
And this seems to be a kind of constructive way of, yeah.
I wonder if that happens, so if we think about conversation as art, so the dialogue, the exchange between problem owner and problem solver, if you like, which is sort of articulating the picture in words rather than in drawings. Is that itself a form of art which is bringing the cybernetics into genuine dialogue?
I don't know.
Well, why I ask the questions, because we don't know the answers. Jonathan, I think you've had your hand up for a while, and then Michael, I think.
Okay. Yeah, so one or two bits I've kind of popped in chat, but I can see the parallels between Vanilla's presentation and James in that there's a kind of natural chaotic diversity in the art world, that you start up with 1,000 artists and maybe only 100 will produce art that people want to buy. So there's a kind of feedback mechanism, both with the artist producing the art. Sometimes it's the 50th or the 100th version is the final version of something, but the feedback with the audience. And then another layer of feedback where sometimes once an artist becomes popular, they become even more popular because they're popular. So there's a kind of feedback mechanism within the audience and society going on. I can see a parallel with your comments, James, about the diversity and the 48 definitions of cybernetics. And there's a similar thing. And maybe like in the art world, there's a kind of clientele thing going on. In a particular artist might have 50 people that appreciate their art and nobody else. Maybe in the cybernetics world, maybe the 48 definitions is a bad thing. Maybe it's not a bad thing because it's the application of the same basic suite of concepts, but in ways that might actually be more useful to different clienteles. And to the other point about the kind of the abstract versus concrete, I personally find this forum useful because it kind of lifts me to a more abstract level on things, which I then don't, it's not necessarily a conscious application, but it does raise me up. So then when I go back to my day job, it gives me a wider perspective to then maybe reframe problems I've got back in my day job.
It is useful in itself. So Miguel, your comment in the chat there about the big drift in society, would you like to share and elaborate?
Yeah, this is just like a gut impression, but I've always been kind of a geek, and so I really enjoy this, you know, just get down and dirty and figure out how things work. And I've been averse to finding out why things work. And I think as the economy especially evolves, the younger generation gets into that mindset. I think it's reflected in the curriculum in schools now. It's very much more pragmatic, not so much, let's think about this. So I think cybernetics, and I put philosophy into the same boat, seem to suffer from that. People like to get together and chat, you know, at the pub, but when it comes to work or anything else. They just want to get things done, and that's it.
Does that mean we're not thinking, or does it mean we're assuming an answer, you think?
I would say we are thinking. It's just the type of thinking has changed dramatically.
Oh. Bruce.
Great, thank you. I was listening to Vanilla's presentation, and I drew a picture, and basically was a person creating a picture and another person responding to or reacting to the picture. And the word that I put on the creator was creativity, and that was mentioned a couple of times. So to me, this pattern I see everywhere. We're all creators, and the most successful changes I've been through are ones where we co-create. So there's quite a powerful kind of connection between this idea of creating anything, creating painters, pictures, or even a process in a business is a creative activity, or creating a product. So I find that fascinating. And the reason I wanted to talk about this is because that's where I see a lot of cybernetics, is at the communication and the creativity area. My interesting challenge is that when I learned about engineering, it was very heavily in control theory, and we saw systems everywhere. But I took some cybernetic courses, and then I started taking some management courses, and I saw systems in cybernetics and those kind of interactions. And I've been taking those with me through the many years and many experiences that I've had. But the fascinating thing is that when I look at problems, and I listen to some people, they call them systemic problems, and other people call them cybernetic problems. I think it's the language that we have that kind of separates us from understanding and having a consistent understanding of how this all works and how these play together. One of the things I wanted to do, sorry to ramble, but one of the things I wanted to do was understand this concept of general systems theory. And I went back and read Bertalanffy's book. And there he talks about systems and says cybernetics is a subset of systems, which is quite interesting because there's a language of systems and then there's a language of what types of systems we're looking at. And I think we mix the types of systems sometimes with the approaches to systems. And somehow there's, I think, a way of unraveling some of this so that we have better communication and better understanding of where these areas fit. And so as an example, when I take that picture that I drew, there's a person who's a creator, but that person is a system and they have certain characteristics. And what they create may be considered a system, and how other people perceive that or interact and communicate, that forms a new system. So it's seeing all these systems and then talking about the characteristics of them. But part of my reason for joining the Cybernetics Society was to understand how cybernetics fit with all these other terms and ways of working. There's definitely wicked problems that need to be solved, and we need to somehow find a way of working together and having a common language and getting maximum value out of this whole area. I find it very huge opportunities, but the words tend to get in the way. And I find it really, I think James was getting at that in terms of some of his presentation today. Thank you. Sorry to ramble on, but
thanks, Bruce. Thomas, is your hand up, Thomas, or are you just pointing at the ceiling?
No, it's up. I just kind of want to affirm kind of what he said, and that like language, and that is like a big sort of like problem. even now trying to convey like cybernetics and certain cybernetics thinking to sort of like the area I'm kind of in, it's very difficult, even though I do see similar sort of things between what's happening here, what's happening there. But then you have these different types of languages, of ways of speaking at the problem, and these people have got these associations about what you're doing, you've got their associations with what they're doing. And a lot of it comes down with, like, at least in my personal opinion, to not actively trying to understand how the other person views their own sort of perspective kind of like first. I think a lot of the time where cybernetics has kind of been quite fruitful, and you can see this like looking at the introduction of Norbert Wiener's kind of like book, is people actively trying to understand what the other person's doing in their own terms first, building it up, and then once having like a rough idea as to sort of like okay, what's going on in this field, then they can have like a active and effective, semi-effective discussion, because they know what they can do in the other person's discipline and what they can't do in the other person's discipline. So I'm talking to a student recently, and his method, like mentioned method acting as a useful way to sort of understand other people's kind of perspectives, because it kind of like forces you in a sense to take on those person's commitments as to how they kind of perceive the world and that. And anthropologists, I think, those who go out in the field kind of like do this field. And what I've noticed from the sort of like Macy conferences and what Rosenbluth and also Wiener had to say is like, look, if you're going to engage in like cybernetics, you first need to commit to trying to understand what the other person's doing first of all, so then you can create a meta language by saying, okay, this discipline can do this thing, but these things are prohibited, but let's just focus on what it can do rather than what it can't do, and then kind of like go from there. But this isn't a problem with just cybernetics, it's a lot of fields and that have this kind of like problem whereby you kind of get this kind of egocentricity, like epistemological egocentricity, where you take your epistemic perspective first and then you try to subordinate others to it, and that, rather than doing the inverse, whereby, okay, I don't know what you're talking about, but I'm going to try to understand it first of all, purely for the sake of understanding it. After that's kind of done, then I'm going to sort of try to sort of like figure out, can I apply it in my own field, or can we work together on some practical kind of like projects? At least that's kind of the feeling I've been getting like with my work and that I've been currently doing for my PhD. But I do think it's a big kind of thing, but that's all I was going to say.
Thanks, Thomas. I think there's a sort of big part of language separates us as much as it unifies us. Disciplines divide us and divide our thinking, because some people will use the disciplinary boundary as a device for creating difference, where at a deeper level perhaps none exists.
But it's not even so much disciplines in themselves. You could say, oh, we're going to be anti-disciplinary and go to just talk about fields of study, or we're going to be transdisciplinary, but they're not, people aren't getting around sort of these problems. There was an interesting case study by a guy called David Davies, whereby one approach a bunch of people engaging in an interdisciplinary project had was, okay, we're going to get rid of like all the complex jargon, we're just going to talk in everyday terms. That didn't work because people had different associations as to what these everyday terms kind of like meant. But it's not even so much language, it's also the different practices and stuff like that. For example, one thing this guy documented was a bunch of chemistry students going into industry, but then a chemical engineer had to reteach them how to work in sort of that environment, because the chemistry students were so focused on getting very precise margins of errors. But because you're in business, you don't care about having a very strict margin of error. It's just good enough to get sort of the task done and sell the product. So there's a lot going on. There's just so much like problems that occur, and these are all problems I think related currently to cybernetics, whereby it is incredibly difficult to kind of talk to people to begin with, and then to talk to us, and for us to gain like a level of understanding where we can effectively work together by first mapping out what we can do and what we can't do. So I mean, it's not a positive like thing, but it's like that's kind of how I see it, basically.
There's a kind of exploratory process to that, which requires an open-mindedness and acceptance on both parts of the conversation, which is sadly sometimes adrift. Fabian, I think you've had your hand up longest, then Michael, then Ben, and I'm not ignoring you, James. You're in the top left-hand corner of my screen. I can so Fabian, if we come to you now.
Okay. One of the things I've been looking at recently is the kind of evolution of class formation of the bourgeoisie in the 19th century. Development, particularly in the area I moved to recently, Suffolk. And a series of interrelations emerged from that with the kind of archaeological societies coming up in the 1840s. And one of the things I came across was an artist who, when his father died, took over the family business, which is a photography business. And that really brought home to me an advancement in technology, the creation of machine, then transforms art. Because whereas a lot of artists earn their daily living by providing these portraits or providing pictures which could then be turned into etchings and used in books, that area of income for them in sustaining themselves evaporated when somebody could just go and take a photograph, and suddenly all these photographs started to appear in books. And the reason why we know so much more about the period from the advent of photography is because we have the number of images increases dramatically. And then the artists, in order to reflecting on their own viability, reflecting on what they're doing and why am I trying to reproduce an image which camera can take like that, albeit in black and white. So that made me really think how we need to see how the artist exists within a system. Machines, technological changes come along, and then that leads, particularly by the time you get to the early 20th century, to a whole load of artists rethinking their role, rethinking about what they're doing, and seeing that in terms of graphic reproduction, it's a different ball game. Some of them, like Man Ray, go into manipulating light through various ways. And really that just continues right the way through to the present, as we have successively more and more sophisticated ways, even to the point of having Zoom meetings where suddenly, despite a pandemic and being separated across the world, we can all come together and have a discussion. So these are systemic changes which are feeding back into the positions that we as cyberneticians or cyberneticists, if that's how you regard yourself, well, you know, that feeds back into us, and then we are moderating our behavior and thinking of ways in which we can make use of these affordances, and even in this discussion, looking at how we can see avenues of great relevance for our thinking.
Fabian, how does that explain social class formation in the 19th century?
Because you see how through the creation of assembly rooms, which happened in Ipswich, but also in a whole load of other places, the bourgeoisie constitute themselves as a meeting ground of their class, where the young people meet each other, marry, and then create the next generation with some intermarriage into the old aristocracy, and landed wealth and industrial wealth start to fuse. So these are the venues where they actually socialize.
Okay. So we might form a new class here.
Always happening. Michael.
Hi, yeah, thank you. Just responding briefly, it struck me as surprising first that these two subjects are being placed together in a way, cybernetics and its relation to art, and then the pragmatic uses and the value of cybernetics. But thinking about it, there seems to be some sort of synergy between the two kind of ways of thinking, and also responding to Andrew Pickering's kind of I don't know, it sounded like an appeal for more people to do more complex or cybernetic type work rather than, and I think the term fine art is sort of unfortunate, and it's sort of specific as well to maybe Northern Europe. In the rest of Europe, the term autonomous art is used, you know, too. And there's much misunderstanding. I think there are often very crude and simplistic ideas about what people study when they study art and what people do as artists. Even the fixation on the kind of visual and on the retinal, that was put to bed long ago by Marcel Duchamp, who reacted against that idea. Even people like Picasso, he said, I draw what I think, not what I see, you know. And these were provocative ideas at the time. So artistic practice these days can involve very complex kind of, and very simple, but not just related to kind of what we see simply as visual art. And there's too often, especially among scientists, I think, an imaginary idea of art as something which is kind of illustrative and about beauty and really outdated romantic notions. Art has gone through so many convulsions and almost self-destructed in a very exciting way at various points too. So that history, I think, needs to be understood before people really kind of engage or are able to function as artists. And artists themselves don't necessarily get that through book reading. They might do it through practice and through reenactment of various sorts. But I do think there are threads that are of great value and that seem to overlap with cybernetics. As I've said, the idea of truth to materials, which is a very important historical design concept, the idea of expediency. Artists, generally speaking, train themselves or are naturally inclined to dealing with uncertainty and the unknown and being intrigued by it and not trying to change it, actually. So observation is an old function of art. Painting things, warts and all, looking at things as they are, not how you imagine them to be, which has connotations for the origins of science as well. So maybe artistic practice, kind of possibly it's possibly about observation. Maybe if you create work which is consciously cybernetic, and many artists have done that. You know, Andrew mentioned some of them. But there are people like Jeremy Deller, who I put a link in the chat there to the work he won the Turner Prize for. If you were to interpret that, you could easily employ cybernetic thinking as a way of trying to understand what he does. Really interesting artist. But maybe art gives comfort. Maybe it's a way of finding enchantment in the world. And maybe these kind of models that are created by artists as they proceed are metaphors for how the world works. And that can be potentially useful. And maybe lastly, does cybernetics and certain kinds of fields of science, does it have to be about didacticism, control, and changing the world? Isn't it also important to kind of be able to evaluate and deal with what we've got? Marcel Duchamp actually provocatively once said, there's no solution because there's no problem.
Interesting. Ben.
Yeah, I just want to, this is a comment in response to, I think it was some of Bruce's discussion, going back a little bit, and also going back to some of the things James was saying about definition and And I think, and the question, you know, why is no one calling for cyberneticians to do something? And of course, one of the reasons no one's calling for cyberneticians to do something is because what does a cybernetician do? And that partly just comes from it being a bit of a weird word, which is Wiener's fault, right? He gave us this word. And partly that actually as a discipline, it's quite confusing, like it's quite hard to define. And I think that's not, well, in comparison to systems science or systems theory, the systems theory people, because they think in terms of, the whole discipline is in terms of parts and wholes, they like drawing diagrams, or the community likes drawing diagrams of how all the parts, you know, neatly relate to each other. And so cybernetics, of course, appears as a part in Virtual Amphi, as someone was saying. And it's all really well structured. And then in cybernetics, it's not well structured because it's not really clear, you know, the ideas don't belong in one part, they move between the different contexts. And that's actually what's interesting about cybernetics, that you try and kind of define it in one place and it slips through your fingers and runs off down another avenue and appears in another place, and the connections it makes can be really exciting. So I guess I want to make a plea for the value in the difficulty of tying it down, and that's something it contributes, and it means a kind of restriction on certain other things it might do if it was all a bit more straightforward. But if you bring cybernetics into play in a situation, it can be very unsettling. And if you want to change the world, then being unsettling is quite a good a good stance to take. And then just to connect that back to the art discussion. So yeah, John, when you picked up from me, you went kind of maybe to visual methods, and that wasn't really what I was thinking of. Obviously, that's a really important thing, but I'm thinking more about kind of new technologies and technological platforms and things, and obviously things like Musicolor and Generator, Colloquy all have a history in that world. And I think making the kind of tech platforms that we potentially developed in the next 10 years, the kind of new paradigms that are coming forward, I think cybernetics seems to have potential paradigms for how they get designed, which possibly is a place where some of Andy's desire for that kind of more concrete examples and more the tradition from those artworks, I can see a kind of application for.
Okay, James, I'll take one point from James, and then I'm going to propose we have a sort of 10-minute break to get ourselves comfortable again, and a cup of tea or whatever else, or retrieve a mince pie. So James, quickly.
Yeah, I was, when I put my hand up, I just wanted to comment on the art piece, because there was a conversation going on about the appreciation of the art by third parties and so forth. So I'm not unknown to mess around, although not very proficient at being creative and artistic. And in my mind, there's a communication between the artist and the medium, and there are controls around the medium that you're using, your skill, what you've got, and so on, and you create something. That the art process is then complete, or could be, because you could put that in a cupboard. That's where most of my art goes anyway. You could put it in a cupboard and no one ever sees it, but you've still gone through a process of creating some art. As Vanessa said, you get your tingles and your, oh, that's right, and all the rest of it. But then there's another part of the process where you actually put that out for somebody to see it, and then they interact with it. And then there's another part of that other part of the process where you may be trying to communicate something, not just to yourself and work something out, but communicating to others. Those are both separable cybernetic, in my view, processes, or one whole process if someone else is then looking at it. And every person that comes along and looks at your piece of art, whether it's mundane, brilliant, or otherwise, you gain a response from them, that response being mundane or otherwise. And nowadays we artificially separate artists from scientists, because obviously go back in the day, they were anatomists and they were scientists, and that how they worked out what they wanted to do with things. So that's it. It's cybernetic.
Back to man-made disciplines, and talking of man-made disciplines, I'm going to go to a man-made kettle on and to make a cup of tea. So I suggest we back in 15 minutes and we'll carry on. That gives everybody time to make a cup of tea. And then I want to pick up Andrew's thread around what are we going to do about it, which is probably a bad way of describing what I think Andrew was saying, but doing stuff I think is important. All right, so we'll leave the system running, but see you in 10. So you in London, David? You're on mute.
Yeah, I'm in London. I'll be popping back to Lyme Regis on Monday to put the festive Christmas tree lights out there and give a simulacrum of something or other, because before I hop back again. But yeah.
So Christmas in London then?
Yeah, with the ex-wife, but her partner is going to come and rescue us towards the end of the day. My son orchestrates this, and yeah, family systems problems are among the more complex. But this is going far better than I expected.
Oh, don't say that. We've got an hour and a half to go yet.
Okay, right. Well, as a child, I had this theory that all adults repeated themselves, and with some it was about after 20 minutes, and with the more intelligent it was roughly every Christmas, and so on. So mostly we repeat and remind ourselves of what we already believe.
Well, I think I know that for me the kind of the point of the exercise is to set the hairs running and see where they end up, and yeah. Other than trying to make sure that people get reasonable amounts of microphone time, I'm desperately trying not to guide it anywhere in particular.
Well, we may come up with something absolutely new and brilliant, which somebody understands. But what I have really been riffing off in the last year or so is Genevieve's concept of agonisist, which is as good as if it didn't exist. And this doesn't merely apply to the multiple sets of tools which you've irredeemably filed under your kitchen cupboard or something like that. It applies to all the books which you've read and forgotten most of the contents, and all the ideas that you've had which you fail to apply in situations where they could have been efficient and effective. In other words, we've probably got the resources we need to sort out most things. It's just recalling and applying, and you know, obviously cybernetics ought to be good at that. I don't think it is, but it's better than not cybernetics.
Hi, David.
Hi, Genevieve.
And John and everybody.
Hi, Genevieve.
Great to see you here, David. Thanks for your card.
Okay, yeah.
Yes, I'm listening, and as an exist, actually, yes, is a really important concept as I see it. But yeah.
In terms of wasted resources, there's not much more in terms of resource wastage than agnosist, as far as I can see.
Well, yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
So should daft, no, I don't think it is a daft question really. Should we be pursuing efficiency or should we be pursuing effectiveness? Anyway.
Well, they need to both go together. I mean, I know they're a bit antagonistic, but yes, efficiency and effectiveness. You've got to measure the two. I mean, and efficiency at all costs is unhuman. It's yeah. I mean,
I got the same question, John, when I was applying, one of two people for a job as a lecturer in cybernetics at City University. I failed to get the job.
I have this theory in my head that a system can only be efficient if it's first effective. If it's not doing what it's for, then any measure of efficiency is moot. It has to be. It has to be, you know, doing. Accepting then that the purpose is observer defined. So, you know, is it effectively doing whatever it is I've decided I thought I wanted it to do when I looked at it? Is a, you know, and then efficiency is measured in terms of that construct.
Wait, can you repeat that? It's quite a good aphorism.
I was talking, not listening. What did I say?
It was like something about efficiency systems. If it's not effective,
a system can only be efficient if it's effective.
Okay.
Its effectiveness is a function of its purpose, and its purpose is observer defined.
Or it's
So I observe I impute, if you like, the purpose of the system through my observation, which is
No, I think
probably
it
a
was
reflection
more
of
the
my
thing that the system has intended purpose, which is meant for like being efficient, but for it to be efficient, it has to be kind of efficient to begin with, or something. I don't know.
I'll work it out.
You said something of some repute, but I can't remember what it was, but it did like gel with me because it's like, yeah, that applies for a lot of like job interview type roles, I think, whereby the people doing job interviews, they're not necessarily effective at doing the interviews because it's not what they're trained in originally kind of like doing. And yeah, that's, I don't know, it meant something to me. That's what's important.
Well, I think it's really around Stafford talked a lot about purposeful systems. And I remember, I can't remember which book he's in it, but he wrote extensively about how the railways stopped him working because if he couldn't smoke, he couldn't work, and if he caught a train, he couldn't smoke. So therefore, the purpose of the train was to stop him working. I can't remember if that's in Brain or Diagnosing or
Part of Enterprise, I think. That was the first book I wrote, and that's also really easy to get into. I was quite surprised. Because I had no mathematical training at that point. I had to get the mathematical training later, but to read that, it was quite a good book.
I started with Diagnosing, then did Heart, then did Brain, and then did Decision and Control. I probably should have done the whole damn thing in the other order. But you only find that out after you've read them, don't you? Are we all back, more or less? Richard Berry, you've been hiding in the background, which is good. Have you been listening to any of this and thinking about it, or are you still getting your cup of tea? It's hard to tell when people haven't got the camera on whether they're actually here or not. The purpose of the exercise is to have a conversation, and we seem to be having a conversation. Precisely where it goes, I had no stated intent, so I'm sort of quite comfortable with where we are. Vanilla, you'd like to come back in? Your hand is waving. You're on mute. You're still on mute, Vanilla.
Okay, is that it?
Oh, that's better. Your camera's gone, but your voice is here.
I wanted to show you this. Can you see it? I've lost my vision.
No, turn your camera back on.
Oh, right, I've turned the camera on. Genius. Yeah, there we go. Okay, this is what I wanted to show you. My scarf. Now, this is written on a jacquard loom, and it in binary, and it actually says, "The purpose of the system is what it does."
Thank you.
I thought that was deserving of sharing. I will now retrieve
it is. And so maybe, Thomas, that comes back to your point then. The purpose of the system, what it does is as defined by its observer, as we interpret the behavior of the thing we're observing. So where do we get a scarf of that that type, Vanilla? Where would we go online to get one?
Get in touch with me and I'll put you in touch with my friend What Made It.
Perfect. Yes, Richard Berry, I was talking to you, shouting at you. I appreciate your signal is weak there in the wilds of wherever it is. Are you able to communicate with us?
John, I don't know if you can hear me, but I get probably every other word, but I did hear Berry, so I thought I'd call in.
Yeah, no, we're just interested. So for those of you who don't know, Richard is in the latter stages of writing up a PhD on data and policing and trying to do very practical stuff with cybernetics in that context. But Richard, if your signal's too weak, it may be that you can't really contribute.
Well, I can certainly try, John. Well, if you can hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you. Just talk.
Yeah, so practical contributions, perhaps, is the thing to explore. I would advocate, I see so many things not working practically that we have to consider the complexity, particularly of the present data environment, but also the forthcoming data environment in different ways. And we see lots of efforts at change, systems not delivering effective practical change, and the same symptoms of problems manifesting themselves. What I will sort of share, and it's a very, very broad example, but if we go back to, let's say, the Yorkshire Ripper and the inquiry that Sir Lawrence Byford conducted afterwards, and that focused on, quite simply, systems and information. It's the ability to share information across systems. This is pre-digital, and essentially identify patterns that will tell us who the killer is. And there were opportunities lost in that case. If you fast forward then to 2002, 2003, you have the Sower Murders, Holly and Jessica, and that was simply about data sitting in another system that, if it was appropriately shared and highlighted, would have prevented something very tragic happening. Okay, so we then have the Bichard report and lots of systems suggestions, and I'll call them quasi-cybernetic approaches, John, because technology seems to be the answer to everything rather than how we use it for its purpose. And then we come forward to perhaps more recent tragic events, and the issue of what did police actually know in their data systems about Wayne Couzens, who had clearly a pattern of offending that wasn't brought together and aggregated, and we end up with yet another tragic murder. So what can you conclude from that? Well, you conclude that there have been lots of attempts, lots of big inquiries trying to discover the problem, trying to articulate the solution at different stages of digitization, yet we haven't actually solved it and have thrown literally tens, if not hundreds of millions of pounds at technology. So I think cybernetics, practical cybernetics, offers a very positive way about thinking about problems, particularly policing and data problems, in a different way. And I apologize, that's the dogs in the background.
So what you're saying, Richard, is that we adopt a technology rather than thinking about the problem. We go back to the not thinking about things, but just I can't remember who it was. Now, somebody a while back was talking about. I think it was in education. We stop thinking. We just keep doing.
Yes, we're not looking at the purpose of the system, John. And you know, I was listening to the dialogue earlier about purposeful approaches. We simply buy the next shiny thing, listen to engineers who will talk us about wonderful engineering, but perhaps not engineer the solution we're looking for. And reading one of my interviews only this week, the idea that government is perhaps considers innovation and these kinds of transformations as investing in widgets and technology rather than looking at the system. And I think cybernetics practically offers a different way. Unfortunately, we're not doing that at the moment, and it's the way things are structured. Use of the Treasury Green Book, reductionist culture in you know, the kind of civil service environment, wanting to see key performance indicators and all sorts of really measured things, but perhaps not relative to the problem. So there's a lot to unpick there. But again, I'll come back to my point. I do think cybernetics has significant value to add practically, particularly in the complexities of the data environment we now exist.
If we get challenging just for a minute, then are we as a bunch of cyberneticians hiding ourselves from the world and whinging internally that nobody's listening, but not actually trying to talk to anybody? Or are we trying to talk to them and they're not listening? Or perhaps are they incapable of listening because of the institutional structures that have been created? Or some combination of all three?
Well, I was going to say tick all of the above. No, I think cybernetics has been misinterpreted. When people hear the word cyber, they immediately start thinking of all kind of internet-y type things, and it kind of, I think there's something about communicating meaning of the very word cybernetics. I think you're right about hiding lights under bushels, because people don't understand it is not in mainstream practices, let alone mainstream management or senior leadership education. So I think stepping into that environment could significantly help. And internally looking, yeah, I think it is. It's still yet to get its definitions right. It's still yet to get its elevator speech out there. But what I would say is the timing's really useful, because at the moment I don't see our present ways of operating and looking at the needs of transformation, particularly in the data environment I've been looking at, as being match fit. The agility isn't there, the complexity is not dealt with, and dare I say, some of the systems aren't seemingly viable when you look at even the VSM as a way of considering the way these meta systems operate.
Okay, so if we widen the conversation out to everybody else again, then, because that's sort of really quite helpful. You talked about then about transformation, and you talked about us being a little bit self-indulgent. How then people, if the things that we think about in cybernetics offer different ways of thinking about solving the problems in the world, if we want to call it that, or ameliorating them, or moving them on, or massaging them, or whatever it is we want to do with them, what can we do to demonstrate the relevance of the cybernetics in a language that can engage the wider community to which we seem to be wanting to address ourselves? Sorry, a badly phrased question, but you get the idea. Malcolm, did you want to speak?
Oh,
or were you just coughing?
No, and I didn't even cough, I don't think. I was just thinking, but now that you asked me, one of the things that I've often said both here and in separate systems forums is I sometimes think there's a reluctance to engage with the dirtiness of politics, because isn't politics the mechanism or the vector of change? And I think sometimes, you know, I mean, there's an interesting article I came across recently about Dominic Cummings, so very British politics here, being very much a cybernetician. I've already sort of like cited Marxism and the Frankfurt School from a kind of systemic perspective. So it's kind of like, can we even be talking about change unless we actually engage with politics?
I like that. I might argue about whether Cummings was a cybernetician, because anybody incapable of self-reflection is probably not going to be great at cybernetics. But I kind of take the point. That's a really interesting question. So, can we do cybernetics without doing politics?
I think if you pretend not to be doing politics, you can do politics a lot more effectively.
Go on.
And you set up the definition, define or be defined, as Thomas says, and your objective definition of things is probably going to work a lot more better, is going to work better than if you set something up as a battle between cooperation and competition or whatever. But there are so many perspectives here, and as I said in my comment here, you've got to be ready to look at the perspective of the person you're interacting with if you've got to have a hope in wherever of bringing them round to your opinion, and you've got to be open to being brought round to their opinion as well. I think they call it dialogue.
Okay, so are you bringing people around to your opinion? And this is not just politics, but cybernetics in general. I think particularly the cybernetics of dialogue. Are we bringing people around to our opinion, or are we synthesizing a joint opinion that's emergent from the conversation?
Hopefully, the latter. Yeah, a couple of months ago, on the 10th anniversary of Occupy London, there was a small group outside St Paul's, and as I sort of displayed a sort of 5-metre banner, someone in the church called the City of London Police. When the van arrived with these guys, I thanked them for participating in the theatrical event that we were doing, and they totally got it. Immediately, and you know, we had a happy conversation, and you know, then pass the thing on to somewhere else. So yeah, co-evolution of concepts is probably the only non-coercive, not too coercive resolution of the mess that we're collectively in at the moment.
So and again, try to widen out. Does that then give us a possible pathway for increasing the relevance of cybernetics to society by having a different dialogue?
Well, like I say, it is the problem of teachers, speaking as an Ofsted inspector. They want to hammer their worldview prematurely. I'm reading a book which probably everybody else has read years ago, Hawk, by Helen MacDonald. And again, she has to start from the worldview of the hawk in order to co-develop the hunting, if you want to call it that, sort of collaboration between the two of them. But yeah, it's going to the effort to sort of understand other minds, and not only has not cybernetics not done this well enough, most subjects haven't done this well enough.
Okay, thank you. Boris, you've got your hand up.
Yes, do you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, can I say something?
Sure.
Do I have time limit?
Yeah, go for it.
Okay, first let me notice that I'm not good as you are in expressing thoughts in your language. I'm foreigner, so I hope you'll understand me. I also wanted to say that if you don't think that I say something right, please correct me. Maybe we are talking about the same problem, the basic problem of human race, how to understand each other, how to communicate. Maybe it's the biggest problem of human civilization. I probably don't need any evidence. It's a conflict picture of the world is every day on the news, not mentioning wars and threats for the world peace, like in present moment, Russians, NATO, and so on. People simply hardly find common language to solve basic problems of existence, or in Esbish's words, survival. I'd like to add something to Malcolm's presentation, as I think that purpose of cybernetics is to explore purpose. That's what I think is hidden in word steersman as the basic explanation of cybernetics. It seems to be a new science of goal achievement and understanding how organisms function, and along that how machines function. Control and communication seems to additionally explain the way how goals, purposes, or expectation could be achieved in words of systems thinking. Understanding how organisms function to form and efficiently achieve goals seems to me central point of cybernetics. I also think that if we are talking about cybernetics, we could follow original meaning. Otherwise, it's possible that we are talking about something else. My opinion is that basic problem in living organisms functioning is how purposes, goals are formed inside and how organisms realize them. And I think that the tough problem is how to achieve goals and purposes. The problem is probably how to correct deviations from efficient goal achievement. If I remember right, Malcolm pointed to the one purpose of the cybernetics, how to unite language of people, how to focus efficiency on the solutions of the problems of humankind. I think that cybernetics works as some glue to human thinking. It seems to me that cybernetics is language interface which can integrate all kinds of knowledge to understand universe, planetary system, Earth, living beings, and their societies. I experienced Vanilla's presentation as some kind of walk through history of human goal achievements. Probably the basic question is how these achievements were produced in such human biological architecture and realized. Or I didn't understand what was meant by achievements. Any ideas, Vanilla?
Did you get that, Vanilla? You're on mute.
Et voila.
I'm sorry to deprive you.
I got that talking about humans, and then I kind of lost it. What was that about humans, really? I was wondering.
About achievements of humans, how people
achievements.
Achievement. All this, what is civilization, is achievement of humans. Understanding of universe, it's some kind of achievement, and understanding each other is achievement in today's conflict world.
Well, in today's world, for some people, getting through the day is an achievement, with or without communication or anything else. Yeah. Sorry, I'm interrupting you.
No,
please.
So picking up from that, this popped up while Boris was speaking. So Wendy Grossman, welcome. I'm not sure we've met before, Wendy. You've put in the chat, to find common language, you need common incentives. Would you care to talk about that for a minute?
It's just not really. It's just that what's that old line about if a man's salary is dependent on his not understanding something, he won't understand it. And a lot of the times when people aren't understanding each other, it's because they don't actually have the same goals. Even if it sounds like take climate change. We all should have the same goal about preserving the climate. But how do you? No amount of fixing the language is going to solve the problem that half of the people are insisting it's not happening.
Okay.
I was probably thinking something like that.
So how might we get people to engage with that?
You've been watching the pandemic for the last 2 years, you tell me.
Well, I think changing the information flow for me would be a key part of that, and having perhaps having some information we can actually believe coming out of some of this stuff would be quite useful. Thomas, is that your hand up again, Thomas?
Yeah, it was. I just kind of wanted to sort of like back them up, last person, but it's not just about having sort of like beliefs in regards to what a word means. It's also like the commitments which kind of like back it up, because you could like find like a common language, and that you also have to have not only kind of beliefs but also the commitments to that belief. And the commitment isn't something you say, it's something you do. And if you have like people who use the language of, for example, climate change and, oh yeah, we're going to solve it, and now it's like a terrible thing, they might not be committed to it because their actions, what they're kind of like doing, doesn't necessarily show that they're kind of going to go through with their kind of like claims and that. In regards to, no, I think I just generally kind of like agree with the whole sort of like sentiment. You're not always going to have people who have the same sort of like goals or like agendas as we kind of do, and for those people we can't, there's no point necessarily trying because we have different sets of commitments. What we probably need to do is find those who might share a little bit of the same sort of like commitments, not completely, in regards to what we kind of like want to do, and then just develop relationships with those types of people and that. And they are out there. I've seen it like for myself, like my work specializes in like Gordon Pass conversation theory. And what I've found is there's a lot of similar stuff being discussed at the Pittsburgh School of Philosophy, and that people like Robert Brandom, the deceased Wilfred Sellers, there's kind of similarities like in a lot of saying. It's just a matter of trying to develop dialogue and then kind of like work together with these groups wherever we find them, and then sort of like build it up there. Now, even like within cybernetics, like given what I've seen today, we all have slightly different sort of like aims and objectives as to kind of what we want to do. It doesn't necessarily mean we should completely dissociate ourselves, but if someone wants to focus on this particular thing here or that particular thing there, that's sort of like fine, because it's still operating under sort of the main sort of umbrella. Where it might become a bit more difficult is if it goes too sort of like far and then we can't talk to each other, work to each other effectively. That's when it becomes more difficult, but that always seems to develop in like different fields of study. If you leave it long enough, you do have these different trajectories kind of occurring, and then just going from there and seeing, can we get these different trajectories to come back together and work, or are they just going to dissipate? I think that's what I wanted to say.
I think that does actually link us back to what Wendy was saying, which is the systems in which many people work incentivize the fragmentation into silos or disciplines or labeled and boxed forms of thinking that then get in the way of a sort of striding across the boundaries. The greatest joy in my life is finding a boundary and trampling on it, because that's just sort of what makes me live, I suppose, is kicking through the walls and breaking the boundaries. But it's not a great way to make a living if you work in an institution. Alan, you had your hand up a while. You're on mute.
Yes, thanks, John. Yeah, I've got two examples of these communication aspects of problems. One of my hobbies is verbally fighting with anti-vaxxers on Facebook. And I had a significant victory a fortnight ago when I was arguing in favor of masks, and the anti-vaxxers were arguing against masks, and they were giving me references which included the word aerosol, and they didn't know what an aerosol was. But once I explained what an aerosol was, their arguments completely vanished, and they've kept quiet the ones I was talking to have kept quiet ever since. So that's one example. The second example is that one of my tutees was doing research on the problems of Arabic search engines. And it turns out that the problems of Arabic search engines are based on the lack of a definition that everyone can refer to. Now, there are some religious reasons for this, namely that there are definitions and usages that are in certain religious documents that can't be affected without appearing to be blasphemous or disrespectful to the people writing it in the first place, whose name shall remain, I should keep quiet about. But that's the reason the search engines didn't work, is that they didn't have definitions that unified definitions or unique definitions, and that's why the Arabic search engines were failing, because it was ideologically impossible to refine the definitions concerned. So you've got an obvious cybernetic problem with the search engine. That's like, you know, nobody would say that that wasn't in our area of communication and control, and that's caused by a lack of definitions. And then the other completely example of, if these people had known what an aerosol was, they wouldn't have been confused in the first place. So I think it's about making sure that people have common, unique definitions that they can refer to. And we've had an third example today is about the nature of cybernetics, that there are some systems that are obviously within the remit of cybernetics that involve information flow and feedback and controlling outcomes. And you've got some systems which haven't got any of those aspects at all, that when they've got initial conditions when they start off, which determine the whole process that you're interested in that system. And so my feeling is that if you've got people who've got definitions that they can refer to, and that these are easily available, and if we can refine that as much as we can, then you're gradually, it's optimistic that I'm optimistic that we can gradually come to common conclusions, even with people that we're very, very directly opposed to, as I am, against anti-vaxxers.
So that throws up an interesting question for me, because one of the comments that I think it was Richard made a little earlier was about the complexity of contemporary systems. And of course, what Google seeks to do, what Facebook seeks to do, is reduce everything to a binary, a 1 or a 0, a yes or a no, an in or an out. And of course, human language, human communication is much more complex than that, much more subtle, much more nuanced. And so, what do we lose in the pursuit of the simplicity, if you like, of the binary outcome? What are we losing in the richness of human existence by doing that? I throw the question out, I don't really expect an answer. Fabian, you've had your hand up a while, old chap.
Okay, yeah, on the question of having common incentives, what we have competing collectivities trying to, which collectivity do we join? So we have, looking at, I put a reference to the anti-aircraft experimental section, which was set up in the First World War by the Munitions Invention Department. And this was, I would call it a pre-cybernetics, because actually the question of bullets, and I know we've had that discussion, and specifically anti-aircraft and how you work out what you're shooting at. Starts in the First World War with Archibald Hill, who then becomes involved in operations research later on. So it's kind of inherent in the problems of ballistics, and then kind of branches out. But on a broader level, you have with the First World War, the massive reduction of international cooperation and the mobilization of the economy behind the war effort, whether you're in Britain, whether you're in Germany, whether you're in Russia. I'm not familiar with the situation in France. So what you have is you have a consensus that creates this effort, which, as opposed to which blocked off avenues for peace. And what worries me is we're in a situation where we have a prime minister saying, well, you've got to do this as part of the national effort. At the same time, what energy is being put into dealing with the spread of the pandemic in a lot of the global south, in the knowledge that we all know that the more it spreads amongst enormous populations, the more likely we are to have something like Omicron develop and then come back and infect us. So it's like seeing this happen before our eyes and seeing the way, and this is where the politics comes in. Politicians try and frame things in particular, you know, you're part of this collective, you're part of which nation he's referring to, whether it's English or British, who knows. That's part of the issue that we are being swept along in. And I wish I had some answers to how to respond to this, but I do see it's a problem. So if anybody can help with that, it'd be good.
Do you think then, Fabian, that our cybernetics gives us a means of addressing that? What is it about the cybernetics, the thinking, the tools, the techniques, the methods? What is it about what we are talking about that might let us intervene to effect the way in which governments are dealing with things like, you know, whether it's global warming, which was mentioned earlier, whether it's the pandemic, whether it's the creeping restrictions on our freedoms and the increasing in the surveillance of society. And this is something Richard and I spent some time on Monday. Yeah, what is it about the cybernetics that lets us have those conversations, that might let us have them if we could find the right people to speak to?
My feeling is this, that I'm up for the second order cybernetics as being implicit in the first order. And I know Ashby disagreed with that when Margaret Mead first posed it. But the second order cybernetics is when we look over our own shoulders, when we start to see where in all these systems, what role are we playing in those systems? And through that, we can start to think, actually, where is it and how do we develop the conversations which will help open up the ways of thinking which will actually better address the problems that we as individuals consider. And then, and this is one forum of doing this, but there will be other forums outside of the cybernetics community where we can start saying, well, hang on, you know, and open things out. And that's why I found Alan's discussion of discussing with anti-vaxxers very useful, because again, it's going out of your bubble. It's very easy to talk to people you agree with, but to actually try discussing with people who you actually have significant disagreement. I'm not very good at it, I have to say, but I do feel that that is important, because then you discover which arguments just completely fail for whatever reason, and you find which arguments actually can lead to them change their behavior. So that's what I see. And I think that's an area of self-consciousness which can be inhibited in people, or can be inhibited in certain respects. But I think if we facilitate more confidence in people developing those sorts of channels, then that's a step forward.
Okay. I'm looking at one thumbs up. I've got one hand up in the shape of James. I'm conscious, I'm not going to name names because I don't do that, but there are a number of people in the virtual room who haven't spoken or even indicated a desire to at this point. If you would like to, just wave your hand around and let me know so that we can make sure that we get to hear what you have to say, because there's a lot of thinking going on in this, which I'm finding quite fascinating. So James, back to you. Now I've nudged other people to speak if they wish to.
Yeah, just to pick up on what you were saying, Fabian. So I've been deploying cybernetics from the basis of looking at displacement and control. So, and my background is in human behaviors. So what I'm finding useful is looking at behavior as being a response to displacement. So if you take people who are anti-vaxxers, if you like, their existing state before, sort of coming into COVID, may have been displaced by a whole bunch of things that already happened, so that they are in that camp, if you like, as opposed to in the other camp. And during the process of COVID, they've been reinforced confirmation bias, etc., to either remain in that state or move further into that state and become resistant, such that they build a model of the world which means that whenever you, like conspiracy theorists basically, that whenever you suggest something which is contrary to their model of the world, they already have an answer as to why you would say that to try and change their view, and therefore your view is invalid. So it all becomes a very highly self-referential situation. I mean, I had somebody visit me to sort something out who was going, no, I'm not having the vaccine. And I tried to persuade him, and 8 weeks after that, he was dead. So, and it's just, I mean, it's hugely unfortunate, but that I've had quite a number of conversations like, you know, I think Alan was mentioning, and the model of the world is so embedded that everything comes back to the same answer. And we all do that in our lives, you know, with the things we believe and don't believe and so forth. So sometimes you can find the sort of cybernetic way that will maybe sort of leverage them out. But it's the answer isn't necessarily, it's too late, basically, in a lot of circumstances, unfortunately.
Alan, you're in tears up there. Fabian's got his thumbs up. There's been, and I don't know who else is reading the chat. It's very difficult to keep up with both conversations. Because we have this sort of one conversation going on, and there's been a background conversation going on about drones and robots and second order cybernetics and sentient various things. I wonder if one of the protagonists in that debate would sort of care to bring it into the foreground at this point, because it's I have to read the transcript later. Miguel.
John, it's like the gamers took over. I think the debate is on how much level of reflection and awareness a current device might have, or a future device might have. In this case, James is suggesting deep learning as the model. And so there was a lot of debate about the capacity to make decisions, to self-reflect, become aware, know things, etc.
So are we suggesting genuinely sentient machines at some point in the future?
Well, it depends on what you call sentient. If the machine is able to respond on its own, then it's got some, I mean, in my model of the world, it's got some degree of consciousness. Now, I was in a presentation the other day by, yeah, I think I can mention it because it was relative, it was BAE Systems, which was on another conference. And it was a kind of private exposure. They haven't sort of put this stuff out, but basically they've got a number of designations of how battlefield drones operate. 2 of which are human, or 3 of which are human out of the loop. So at the moment, the human's in the loop, but the others kind of go, we'll inform the human what we're going to do and then we'll do it. We'll inform the human why we're going to do it and then do it. And we'll tell the human after we've done it is like the last one. And what's actually driving this is that because obviously we're heading in the direction of deployment of all these things, and they're already bits that can go out there, 50 kilos of deployable drone off the back of a soldier, with big bangs at the other end of it. Because you end up with machines versus machines, effectively, the human can't make the decision fast enough to respond to the speed at which the machine will take the decision. And there is a sort of, well, my own guess is that we'll end up having to have some kind of international treaty to keep humans in the loop, because otherwise you'll get the kind of Skynet. I know Skynet's kind of overtalked, but you'll get the, you know, go back to the situation where we almost had a nuclear war, except for the guy in Russia who went, nah, this must be a computer glitch. So I'll ignore it. And it turned out he saved us all from blowing each other up. Take him out and make a machine respond to it, and, you know, big bangs and mushroom clouds. So that's one thing that's happening. The other is deep learning, where machines are learning by experience. And there are some limitations in deep learning, because it appears that the amount of memory they need, they keep overwriting what they've learned before. In self-driving cars, for example, they learn something new, but then they overwrite it because they've kind of like got a short-term memory, and they refer back to the short-term memory and wipe out what they had in it before. So there are some developmental issues in it, thankfully, at the moment. But self-drive cars are trying to be taught whether who to kill. So if something goes terribly wrong, do they make an assessment and say, well, there's a child in front of us, so we'll kill the driver effectively, or will we kill the child? And there's a big ethical debate within the self-drive car environment as to kind of how do and can they make those decisions. And that'll all be happening in the car. So you can call that consciousness or not, but that's kind of what it's at.
There's an interesting observation here that I'd like to make, which is, I think this is a key example of where we might try to improve language. Because it bothers me, James, when you talk about cars as they, it's an it, right? And that's at least how I see it. And that's where I think this language thing, it definitely trips me up. Because as I was reading that, you know, you were saying that a car knows, self-driving cars know where they are. I'm thinking, okay, well, you know, my cousin, you know, knows he's close to home, you know, and the car doesn't know where home is until you program it.
So can I just jump in? So real story, friend of mine driving up through Germany in a Tesla, right, going for a destination, and the Tesla car, unbeknownst to them, decided to take them to a Tesla recharge station because they were going to run out of battery power before they got to where they were going. And they ended up at a different designation because the car decided what it needed to do.
But it didn't decide, right? It was programmed to do that. That's where I think the language thing is, right? For me, it breaks down. It's not deciding. It's simply making a measurement and then saying, okay, well, the next logical thing I should do according to how I've been programmed is this. And whereas a person would say, oh, my tank is getting really low, I wonder where I should go to get some gas.
So when I was reading Samuel Butler, what Butler was saying in 1882 was that machines are at a level of development where if you compared them to a basic fundamental biological organism, they're able to do things that would compare to a basic organism, you know, a protista or whatever you want to take it back to. There are organisms that have no neurological system. They aren't self-aware, but they respond to the environment. They move towards or away from chemical responses, light, whatever it happens to be. So they might not satisfy our level of consciousness, but they satisfy a level of biological development on a continuum. So wherever we decide to place them, that's why Butler was saying break the machines. You know, we're heading in that direction, whether they're not at the level of like you're saying, they're not at the level that we're at, if you like. And they'll never be human until they can make illogical decisions. The idea of a human robot is crazy because they make logical decisions. We make illogical decisions, which make us unique and interesting and all a bit weird. No, Alan's going to comment on that in a second. But they are on that you can consider them to be, let's put it that way, on a scale of evolutionary development. So, but not at our position currently, thankfully. But evolving.
I'm going to ask you to repeat all that, James, because I had to. Apologies, I had too many phones in the office and not enough ears. I'm looking for somebody to respond to James.
I'll respond to that. So a lot of the discussion in the chat started off, and I was thinking about what Andrew was saying about, you know, we need to build something to demonstrate what we're doing. So, you know, I'm obviously interested in robots, and for me, it's, you know, could we build a robot, especially something that could demonstrate second order principles, something that could potentially understand itself, but then not in a kind of a pre-programmed way. You know, we can program robots to do anything, but that's kind of just boring, isn't it? They're just computers at the end of the day. even a car running some sort of ethical theory, it's still just a boring program. But to do something truly cybernetic, then it's got to be able to, sorry about the jargon, but kind of enact the world itself, so that it can come up with its own view of the world, simply through observation of the world, not through some existing pre-digested set of symbols or data that we use for machine learning. So yeah, I mean, how we do that, God knows. I don't know, but we kind of, I think we kind of see what some of the steps have to be like to do that. Yeah, so some sort of inactive approach. You know.
So I think the current methods of pre-programming, or the attempt to pre-programming self-driving cars is frankly bonkers. But I think the approach you're outlining there, Steve, might be actually more useful and more realistic in due course. Need to look at what
the German, I was going to say
doing.
The German approach to self-driving cars is just keep driving straight and let people around them jump out of the way, because people will know exactly what the car's going to do. But as soon as you build some randomness into the car, you don't know what it's going to do.
Ben, you had your hand up. Well, you have your hand up.
Yeah, so sorry, I had to just leave the room for a bit. So sorry if this suddenly makes no sense. It's just in response to something Miguel was saying about the importance of the kind of precision of language and they and the car versus it. And I think it's particularly important in the context of the, you know, strange, I think quite strange applications of ethical theories to self-driving cars. And I think that the way those theories are brought in and suddenly they're applied is I think a complete misuse of those theories. And I think that kind of arises in part from something that happens in language where the way we construct sentences, so it's partly we might say, someone was killed by a car, right? So there's partly a lot of information left out of that. But also there's something about the way we construct sentences tend to emphasize part of an interaction. They tend to be quite asymmetrical, so you can say something, I can't think of a good example at the moment, but you can talk about an interaction between two people in a way that makes it sound like the subjectivity is in one place or another. And I think one thing that cybernetics can potentially as a project to help us use language to talk about symmetrical interactions between people. I think that has a lot of, potential benefits in how we then develop technologies and so on.
Would that be then really interesting? So would that be a way of, and I'm linking back to the art here, turning the problem into a shared object rather than a subject in the sentence? So if we talk about the problem rather than about the car or the person, and we actually sort of put it into a third space that's between the two protagonists in the discussion.
Yeah, well, maybe we need to see what it looks like to do that. I think the other thing obviously is just taking a wider boundary is always helpful in this, and I think it's quite, there's no particularly good reason why we're developing self-driving cars. Maybe there is actually someone, or like no one talks about those, right? So there are maybe different things that we I don't know what's the driving rationale for putting all of our tech energy into that right now when maybe some other things need to happen.
I think the notional driving delusion is that self-driving cars will be safer because they won't err, but that seems to me somewhat unlikely. I think
we could just not drive as well. That's another idea, right?
Indeed, but I also think a more realistic political perspective on it might be the mechanisms of state control of the movement of the population, which would seem to be going down terribly well in parts of London and Bristol at the moment, apart from anywhere else, with the sort of limitations on the use of vehicles and all that sort of complex stuff going on. If the state can control where we are, then it can control to a large extent what we do and how we do it, which is potentially quite scary if you're belief in freedom of the individual and all that sort of stuff. So Fabian, you have your hand raised.
Yeah, it's just something that what Steve was saying was maybe I remembered a little bit on the internet somewhere of Heinz von Förster having somebody question about making a kind of robot model of him, a simulacrum of him, and he said, wouldn't it be easier to get an actor to play me? and sometimes there's a level of simplicity that him saying that is saying, well, hang on, you know, and for me, when I hear about, oh, we're going to deal with climate change through technological solutions, I can't help feeling that people are saying, yeah, there's a lot of built-in obsolescence which fits our business model here. We can keep going on for another 10, 20 years with just producing stuff for a market with no sense of actually how we deal with that. So I got given an electric bike, which is like 10 years old, and it's completely useless because all the technology's moved on, and the battery you can't replace or charge or anything like that. So the idea that this is a green industry in some way, that's not my experience. So, you know, it's actually, I feel it's actually taking up examples like this and saying, no, that is not going to be helpful unless you have some, I mean, I'm very much into like open source software and kind of open technologies so that you can say, well, this is what we've done, and anybody can start work on this and do variations. You have that information shared and you can cut out a lot of this built-in obsolescence. So it's things like that and getting some push on that. I'm not sure how we do it, but that's where I feel that it's a lot more on those soft skills and finding the right places to say something that might help people saying, oh yes, that's what we wanted, that's what we were looking for.
Talk to us about greenwash, Michael. Where are you? I can't see on my screen at the moment.
I'm here.
You're there. Thank you.
I just threw that into the conversation following Fabian's point just now. So the idea that certain seeming technological solutions turn out to backfire, not be as good as they were originally intended, operate in ways that we don't know or expect them to work. That's one aspect of it, but potentially there's also obviously the motivations of industry and business, which is to kind of make profits and function in the world. That doesn't always go, you know, greenwash will satisfy that need as much as actual environmental solutions. So it's almost inevitably, and perhaps no one is to blame for this, part of the way things are going to work, you know. And you know, I've been for a few years, I've actually been looking to try and find data connected with wind turbines and wind farms. And you know, from a personal point of view, I'm trying to kind of operate neutrally, and I see the things as potentially wonderful, and aesthetically they're also kind of exciting to kind of witness, really mesmerizing what human beings can do. But it's really quite difficult to get data on their actual environmental cost versus their actual environmental benefits. I mean, there obviously is some cost, you know, creating these huge concrete structures and so on, and maintaining them, and then their lifespans and so on. But the whole picture, the big picture, the systemic picture isn't easy to get to the bottom of because people simply talk in economic terms. And surely there's more to it than that. There must be an environmental payback, which is not the same as the financial paybacks and other kind of accounting that will be taking place.
There's a Dr. Marie, I can't remember how you spell the Marie, it's a Gaelic Marie, Black, I think she was a Scot, who did some work on this at Imperial about 8 to 10 years ago. So she might be worth a look. She was doing some work in the energy sector and was so disgusted by the carbon accounting that she actually stopped working with the particular case study because it was sort of fairly horrific stuff.
Thank you. Could I have a name in the chat, perhaps?
Yeah, I'll try and dig it out. I'll
Cheers,
get it for you. Okay, folks, we are at about 4:20, so we are 2 and what are we? We're 3 hours 20 minutes into the meeting for most of us, which is pretty good going, and we're all still here, and everybody that I can see at least is still awake. We set a sort of target time to finish at about 4:30. Vanilla's already had to leave us because the I think the French internet has died or something, or got COVID or whatever. So we've sort of kind of lost Vanilla, who was one of our key provocateurs at the beginning. We probably ought to aim to finish at 4:30 on a Friday, so that we can all go home early, because it's a long walk from where I'm sitting to home. What do we want to do with our last few minutes together? There's been some really interesting themes coming out for me. I'm not sure I think we've said cybernetics is relevant, but I'm not sure we've said how or why particularly well at this point. So let's go into a sort of final set of what are the further thoughts, questions, what perhaps, being a real pragmatist, what should we do as a result of some of this stuff? That's a good question. Anybody? Ben?
Well, I think, I don't think Andy's still in the meeting, but I think the kind of prompt of like, what are the tangible things is a really good one, but it's quite hard to answer. Like, it's quite hard to just sort of, yeah, okay, here's one, because if you haven't done it, you don't really know what it is. So I think possibly there's an intermediate step, which is what sort of things might they be? And then you can sort of maybe find some of the things that might fit with those that maybe already exist, right? So I think there's maybe a follow-up could be what type of things might cybernetics become tangible in, and maybe if there's an incomplete list of 3 or 4 types of things, that could be a good follow-up discussion that was more focused.
Okay, I think there is another discussion in this somewhere. Anybody else?
Yeah, I mean, I'm wondering if just go back to Norbert Wiener and communication and control. And I think it's been implicit in a lot of this here. I mean, is cybernetics like a discipline, or is it kind of like a meta discipline? I mean, I'm thinking, especially in the chat, a lot of this, I think, comes down to cognition, whatever that is. But it's about cognition. And this idea of then introducing the observer brings us into metacognition. So if you're capable of thinking about thinking, doesn't that just give you a bigger picture? I mean, and I go right back to the arts, it gives you an ironic perspective on the world. And I think that ability to be ironic or metacognitive at least primes you or preps you for doing something completely different. So like whether you're an anthropologist, a biologist, a management consultant, or whatever, if you're capable of metacognition, you're probably that little bit more capable. And maybe that's all really cybernetics is.
When you say more capable, what do you mean? Capability in the abstract is what?
Okay, maybe here, there's a very good article again by Mark Johnson. I can send the link if you like, but talking about Gordon Pask on education. He distinguishes between capability and competency. Now, competency he just sees as basically, skills, doing routine work, whereas capability is to understand and to think and to be able to improvise and react to the unknown. And I think one of the interesting things is as well, with a nod to requisite variety, is he basically says to have capability is to have redundancy, to give multiple descriptions of the same event. So I suppose by capability, I'm thinking perhaps the ability to improvise, to innovate, to not actually just respond to stimuli, but to maybe forge or architect or imagine a future.
Okay, so if we then play with the notion of viability and the way Stafford described the world in terms of what I call managing the present. We're doing what we're doing, creating the future, thinking about what we might do tomorrow, and nurturing identity as the means of arbitrating between those two things. So, so what you're suggesting then in capability is two additional, we can see ourselves, we can see ourselves seeing ourselves, and we can reconcile the tensions between the self we have and the self we'd like to have, perhaps, or the self we feel we ought to have in a changing environment. Is that?
Yeah, I mean, I think again, I'll quote Karl Marx again. I mean, I think he differentiates between humans and bumblebees by saying, I mean, this is moot, but he actually talks about the human can build structures in the imagination. And I think that idea of building a structure in the imagination, building a model of the future, I think is actually quite a profound comment. And I think a wider question here about cybernetics being a meta discipline. I studied Marxism 40 years ago, Marxist aesthetics as it happens. And one of the things I find interesting is the parallels between some cybernetic thought and what I was studying 40 years ago. Now, whether that's, does that mean, Marx was a kind of proto-cybernetician, or does it just mean that I'm completely misunderstanding it?
I think you've actually have some justification there, because I'm currently reading the work of Friedrich Hegel and Gordon Pask, and there's a lot of similarities in particular ways they're kind of talking about kind of like concepts and the same sort of thing. Now, the differences are mostly in the language, because Hegel is just don't read Hegel. He's like,
oh yeah, I mean, and I think for me, I mean, the idea of a dialectic, how different from that? How different is that from a cybernetic feedback loop?
But be careful how you use the term dialectic, because it's one of the most, the term, unfortunately, it's, how do I kind of put it? Originally, it meant conversation, but when it kind of went into sort of Hegel and Marx, it kind of like gained a different sort of meaning, the whole thesis, antithesis, synthesis stuff, which you can, dialectic does have stuff to do with that. We're looking at conversational processes more in a way, in my opinion, like how Pask kind of views it, where it's not just conversation itself, it's conversation plus reasoning, except there's no distinction between the two. Conversation and reasoning are one and the same sort of process, particularly within humans. But I will say, yes, no, there's a lot of similarities between sort of like some stuff in like both Hegel and Marx and in later cybernetic stuff. And I see this a lot with reading the work of Heinz von Forester and Hegel, because in some ways they're talking about the same thing, except Heinz von Forester has a more formal way of talking about it, which strangely enough is more clear than how Hegel talks about it. But as they say in Ecclesiastes, there's nothing new under the sun. Things historically kind of repeat themselves, I find. So I'm not surprised that there are some similarities between what's happened historically here and that here. But I would say both Hegel, Marx, Spinoza, and a couple of others would be proto-cyberneticians in my view. But that's just my biased opinion. So, but yeah.
I don't know whether it's cybernetics in that sense. It's interesting. So Ashby, for example, showed the necessity of autonomy as a structural artifact in the ability of an individual to perform. And so you start to play with, individual autonomy becomes important. You start to find that there are political threads which end up in the same place. And I'm choosing the word political deliberately. They end up in the same place for a very different reason. The fact that we then choose to align the two and say, look, Marxism is cybernetic. Well, is it or isn't it? I don't really know. But it ends up in some of the same places for very different reasons.
Yes, no, you're right. And this is the thing. So you do have to be careful, because they might be partially analogous, but not completely analogous. And that, for me, if they're partially analogous, that's like great and that. But we have to also be careful about not saying that they're completely equivalent. For me, I get very excited when I see, well, this thing's got like a link to this thing here, and then I kind of tend to focus on the similarities rather than the differences. However, if you don't focus on the differences as well, this is what leads to a lot of people becoming disillusioned, because then it's like, well, you're not highlighting the differences and you're treating the two as analogous. I think it's what Pascal's globetrotting, where you're making like vacuous analogies and that by saying this thing's like analogous to this thing's analogous to this thing, but you're not giving the count of like the reasons as to why those are, and checking to see, well, are these reasonings compatible with these reasons over here? Because a lot of the time, either they're not, or they're only partially analogous. So yes, I think you're justified in making that claim.
So Ben's just put a really helpful comment in the chat for you, Thomas. There, that's something you might want to go and read and think about at some point. Here we are. It's 16:28. Have we had a productive and useful, or at least interesting afternoon, people? That's probably the big question. I'm seeing a number of thumbs up. Louise, is that a question or a call for power?
No, sorry, John. I was actually scratching my head. I'm not going to lie to you. But to answer your question, for me personally, as you know, I'm just an enthusiastic amateur currently, to say the least. But this has just been a fantastic afternoon. So I'd like to say thank you to everybody. I found it really informative. I have got lots more questions than I have answers, but I have also got a few answers, which is totally why I'm here, and really look forward to the next one, to be honest. And hopefully catching up with some of you individually would be amazing if you're happy to. So thank you.
I think Steve's comment there, we're all amateurs in cybernetics, absolutely. I think we're all puzzling our way through it, and these conversations for me, they're very exciting and stimulating. They make me do a lot of thinking that I know I wouldn't otherwise make myself do. So our next President Series event is on the 12th of January, when we'll have two, again, very contrasting sessions. One from the Chief Executive of Police and Crime Commissioner's Office, Andy Champness, and Andy's going to be talking about, this is data, I want information. And Tom Dolan's going to be talking to us about infrastructure systems and cybernetics. So heaven knows where that will end us up. I would like to say a very big thank you to James, who's still here somewhere. I can't see. Oh, there you are, James, on my screen, waving at me in the middle, and to Vanilla, who, in her absence, for the time and energy to put the provocations together, which for me has led us to a very stimulating, not a conference afternoon. And I thank you all for great contributions to that. So without further ado, if everybody's happy, I shall say thank you. Thanks to Caitlin for masterminding the bits and pieces of making it all work. Have a great Christmas, everybody, and look forward to seeing you all in the new year. We'll put the recordings on the website as soon as we can translate them into something meaningful. All right. Thanks a lot, everybody.
Bye.
Thanks. Cheers. Bye-bye.
Bye.